there's lots of them, both were really good. There was lots that was really interesting in those things I'd like to pick up on, but just because it was near the end, I'll just pick up on just something that you very emphatically and very, I think, rightly said, but maybe rightly from the point of view of this community, is that we are not duped by animated documentary. Now it's really interesting because I think the dominant documentary community working in live action, inverted commas, think that's exactly what we are in relation to watching animated documentary, that we are indeed duped by it. And partly one of the reasons we're duped by it is because of spectacle and pleasure and aesthetics and interpretation, as opposed to what I was saying to you earlier about, you know, the mass indexing of intent or meaning. What's your take on that? I mean, it would just be interesting to see that relationship and what you feel about that.
I suppose my sort of utopian vision of documentary, which is pretty utopian, I would like to think that people aren't duped, but you remind me that there is a sense of distrust of it, which I think comes in part from a distrust of spectacle and documentary, but sort of anecdotally, a job I previously worked in, I was working in a sort of more practice-oriented department, and I had some colleagues who taught documentary studies, documentary practice. Yeah. And I was introducing myself to them, and they were like, how come you teach documentary and animation? How does that work? I'm like, well, my research is on animated documentary, and they were like, sorry, there is no that can't be a documentary. At which point my steam started coming out of my ears, and but we never, it was an impasse between us. They were like, no, documentary is observational. They had a very kind of high church, observational, fly on the wall, that is the only type of documentary. And I obviously completely disagree with that, but I think that's where part of the resistance comes from, which is what Brian Winston would say. Also, there's this kind of prevalent sense in documentary that for something to be a real documentary, it has to be that kind of observational, non-interventionist style of filmmaking, which I know very much pervades amongst my students when I first get them into my documentary module. I show them an animated documentary and they're like, no, it does not compute. Because we're kind of conditioned, I think, culturally, socially, to think of what a documentary should look like. So I think that's in part where it comes from. But if we look back to the beginning of the history of documentary, they were making stuff up on the right, you know. So yeah, and I think maybe the more animated documentaries that get out there is partly a social cultural condition.
Yeah, question.
Blurring of the real, you both discussed somehow, which is really a topic in. I'm working for the game design department in Zurich, and it's a really big topic in our department, how to blur the real and to be attractive for the gamers, as well as educate them in a special topic. And we have these serious game aspects, and I think it could be for both of you interesting to watch out our page, because there are really a variety of projects which are discussing the blurring of animation and documentary for scientific reasons.
Yeah, one of the things that just sort of spoke to that, one of the things I find interesting is in Wellington we have Weta. Obviously we've got Weta on our doorstep, and they're making the King Kong and these CG films, and it's interesting the number of. We have a whole lot of people coming and giving lectures from Weta, and quite often they're physicists or they're mathematicians or they're chemical biologists, and they use CGI, and they talk about, there's a really interesting tension between to what extent you simulate ocean swells and to what extent you start to break from the simulation and lay the aesthetics over the top. And in all sorts of ways, the ways in which you have explosions and the degree to which audiences become conditioned to expect an explosion to look like one thing, but actually if you simulate it, it looks like something else. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something I think is interesting is it kind of comes to what you were saying as well, which is that there's that kind of interface between, I mean, especially I think with computer-generated animation, you're dealing with maths at a certain level. And so if you're dealing with maths, then you're dealing with something that has always been signified as being empirical, I guess.
So, yes, right here.
Thank you both very much. I think this is maybe a question for both speakers, although provoked by Leon's really interesting comments on the use in Titanic of those early images, the kind of old-style lo-fi resolution. It seemed to me there that it's not just about referring to scientific knowledge or a kind of notion of historical realism there. There's also a kind of Cameron showing a real playfulness and reflexivity and delight in image making in ways that lots of interesting connections with Paul's talk this morning, and also Bella's very nice remark about us being invited to take pleasure in the skill of construction of images. But I thought alongside that playfulness, that moment of kind of, it's a kind of teaser for later in the film, just you wait till you see how we're going to show you this with the state of the art, what we can do now. But that's also embedding in the text a kind of awareness of how rubbishy that's going to look in time, the obsolescence of techniques. And it kind of connected very interesting with some of Bella's closing remarks about the verisimilitude of Walking with Dinosaurs no longer working so well. And I think it raises that whole question of realism being less about indexicality to the real world and more about the realism of a set of conventions, historically located conventions.
And that's something that precedes animation as well, right? And because, I mean, the Stephen Bottomore article on the Panicking Train audience, he talks about, you know, he goes right back to the beginning of film, and he talks about the what does he call it? He's got a specific phrase for the audience, for a conditioned audience, basically, that needs ever higher levels of kind of, and of course, it's a technological thing as well, isn't it? Because then we switch to 60 frames per second, and we start out with trying to have a 3D thing, and discover that it suddenly looks very, very jittery. And just what you're saying there about the playfulness of the image, well, that again I think goes right back to the inception of the moving image in a way, that all of these attractions were always almost advertisements for the cinematic apparatus, full stop, at a certain level. What I find really interesting is the ways in which animated CGI has taken over so conclusively, in a way, from a lot of these aspects that were previously about indexical, chemical-based, celluloid.
Yeah,
I'm really interested in some of the points that you were raising about the tension between what seems to be authored animation, where the decisions of the animator are what really impact upon what an audience sees, and what is simulated animation that uses mathematical or physical modelling to actually make things which are quite believable and real. It seems to me that there's a real move as we go towards increasing realism, that the work that animators do becomes invisible. And I think actually this rise that Bella, you were talking about in terms of explaining what we do as animators is to help people to understand some of the human touch, some of the craft, some of the actual magic that is there, because it's becoming less and less apparent, because more often animation is being used to create perfect simulations of reality. And which brings me on to my point, which is the animation that you've explained, that you've made us aware of, is great, but there's so much more invisible animation going on. When you look at any play from a post-production house, any shot, the levels of what I suppose for a documentary maker would be lie or embellishment in that frame are really quite frightening. I mean, do you think there is a need for us to help audiences to understand what it is that they're seeing, what is manufactured, and what is truth in terms of what animators are doing these days?
Not being a practitioner, I find all that stuff completely fascinating. So I love finding out the kind of tricks and tools of the trade. I don't know whether we have a kind of moral obligation to reveal it to audiences any more than we have a moral obligation to remind people that documentaries are edited together and interviews there's always going to be some kind of level of a great degree of subjectivity in the maker's hand in any kind of public representation. But yeah, I would agree with this sort of invisibility thing. I think is really interesting. So saying something like, Walking with Dinosaurs is more obvious, and you have the animatronics in it as well. But something like the Wonders of the Solar System it's much more invisible, and it's much harder to find out how that the animated imagery was constructed. There's some stuff online, there's like a case study online by the company that did the animated imagery for that, but it's not as detailed, say, as the information you can find out about Graham Store doing Walking with Dinosaurs. And it's kind of blurred much more in the actual text itself. You know, we'll kind of segue from an image that was actually taken from the Hubble telescope to a kind of animation of that image without any indication that we're going from a real photograph to an animated simulation. For example, and maybe there is an argument that there should be a kind of little thing on the bottom of the screen saying reconstruction or something, but I don't know.
Doesn't time do that anyway? I mean, you kind of made the point that in 1999 that stuff looked really real. I think what's invisible today is visible in 10 years' time. And it's very rare that you look at a film that's got sort of special effects or animation included from a while ago and think, yeah, that still looks really convincing. You know, we don't all run out screaming when the train comes towards us in the cinema. We don't, because we know and we understand. And even with live action, I think that's the case. You can look at stuff which is very much cinema rotating and think, oh, it looks a bit cheesy.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm getting really interested in 3D documentary, which for me is just like a bit of a in the old head. But for that very reason, I'm like, just like this ever increasing move towards it. So even in live action, I think it's happening. It's not just animation.
Yeah, Paul.
It's just a link up with that previous point, really, is that one of the reasons I think of the maintenance of the pared down graphics, for example, is that has a much longer history of communicating knowledge in industrial film than, in a certain sense, contemporary documentaries, which are much more photorealistic in that sense and looking to hide, the game. Those graphics that really we're seeing in those films are just 3D graphics that have got a long tradition in industrial film in passing information and verifying information. So I think it's sort of like carrying on with those conventions once again, and they will date less in a funny way by virtue of their graphic representational form than something done in a more specular and sort of photorealistic way, I think.
I think you're right that these wireframe graphics tend to be, they bring with them a feeling that you're being told something, whereas the more spectacular, more realistic animation that you were talking about, you feel like you're being shown something. And there is definitely a grammar around the instructive that these more obvious computer-generated things bring with them.
Yeah, question here. Yeah.
I would like to ask you, have you ever thought of simulation as a way to find a really scientific answer to some problem that scientists are researching? Because I've read about a few projects where simulation and the computer generated animation is used to find answers. For example, for the ants or bees.
It's
It's really an interesting
it's kind of feeding back. It's kind of feedback. Yeah, it's so yeah, Walking with Dinosaurs. Another reason they way they authenticate their sort of narrative and aesthetic approach to that subject matter is they say, look, actually, we figured out some answers to questions that paleontologists have always had about certain dinosaurs and how they move by doing a computer simulation of dinosaur movement, and we figured out that it could do this and it couldn't do that, and therefore the scientific question has been answered. Look, we're valid, we're authentic. So yeah, but I think that it goes. I'm by no need to really know more about this. I don't really know much about that area, but I think, yeah, for sure, I think.
Definitely, yeah. I've had people in Wellington saying about the crowd, the simulations for crowds that they generate for Lord of the Rings, then ending up being used by sociologists and anthropologists for trying to understand the ways in which people behave in large crowds versus. Because what happened was they built this thing and they turned the first time they ran the program, so they had these huge crowds that they've got of people warring in Lord of the Rings, and the first time they turned it on, apparently all of the people ran away from each other, so that they had to change the algorithms underlying it. I mean, it's fascinating when you talk to some of these guys, the degree to which their entire lives are ruled by algorithms algorithms and the extent to which algorithms fail, or not fail, but they're trying to balance that between the simulation and getting what they want aesthetically is a really, it seems to rule their lives.
There's a whole area of scholarship on science, on visualization in science, and the use of CG technology and scientific visualization, which is, I think, this is parallel to what we're talking about.
Just to sort of further that point, I work with a colleague who has worked with forensic science and biomechanics or involves the model, which can help determine, for example, how somebody may have been stabbed or pushed. So,
Patrick Schoberg, who's a scholar of lots of things, including documentary and animation in Sweden, has written a great essay on forensic animation and how animation is used in the courtroom as evidence. It's like a reconstructive tool, which just blows my mind. But yeah.
It's kind of really interesting as well. I can't remember the reference, but someone who works with visualization has written about materially of the visual in science, which is that once something is visualized, it's very hard. Like if you write a paper about something, say archaeology, in an archaeological context, if something's written, then that will be superseded, and that will be, you write a paper and then someone comes on and says, oh no, it's not correct, we found out something different. And then, there's a kind of natural shelf life to that information. If that information is made visual, then the shelf life kind of never ends. It's like, the example was given was a roundhouse. I could think about what a roundhouse was in the Bronze Age. Then I have very strong visualization of what it is because I've seen that illustration. You possibly have exactly the same one, but apparently that's wrong. But because we've kind of got that image in our heads, because we've seen it, the tyranny of the visual becomes sort of embedded in a way that isn't just it's sort of more emotional reaction as well as an intellectual one, which I think is fascinating.
I think to go back to that is one of the guys from Western that I was talking to a couple of months ago. He was saying exactly this. He said that sometimes the difficulties they have is that they want to simulate something, and that their problems now are how to create algorithms that simulate and then what to do on top of that, because no audience watching a Hollywood movie now ever expects an explosion that comes out of a house to actually look like it was simulated, because he said it's so incredibly dull as far as they're concerned. They almost have to, I guess the example in standard film to that would be someone shooting a gun and the sound of it, or punches, But they seem to have that same kind of thing now. He was saying it's a bizarre mixture of simulation and then embellishment over the top kind of thing.
I'm intrigued that this idea of authenticity, but also what any of these films, some of the stuff I talked about, what you guys have talked about as well, what it's actually a documentary of. And I think it's that kind of, one of the questions I was asked was about, well, how do we know the 10 mark is a documentary, or how might we define it as non-fiction and so on. And what you both talked about is this kind of extra textual thing going on, and that bizarre sort of paradox of, you want it to be, in a way, you want it to be noticed, or, depending on the brief, okay, we're noticing that this is a simulation, so go back and do it again, because we want this to be seamless and fit the kind of live action, the composited live actions of the palette. But then, I guess it's one of the things I was trying to get at, and maybe didn't sort of say as well as I might have done, is how some of these films they're not just a documentary, they're not documentary evidence just of a particular person or a set of events, but they're also a kind of documentary trace, if you like, of a certain practice, of a certain set of manoeuvres, off screen in what Edwin Carroll's is called the dark interval, the gap between each frame. In the live action, it's a kind of almost instantaneous moment, but for the animator, it's okay, I'll go in and manoeuvre the character, or I'll go and have a fag break while I'm kind of changing this image for that image. There's all sorts of things that can go on in between. So there's a lot of and it's what it's authentic of, I guess, is what's intriguing me. That it's kind of and that's these terms about embellishment and something extra, and it's almost, you know, it's like the CG animators putting in the artifacts, like, okay, let's put in camera wobble and lens flare and all of these things that can't possibly exist in CG animation, but you put them in to add authenticity, and it's almost how the practitioners want to put that in some kind of way as well, you know, so it kind of reinscribes their labour into the, you know, the fact that somebody's actually bloody made this rather than it being kind of just captured. It's not really a question.
No, that's not fair. Usually you've kind of like got right in the crack and poked around a bit. So I think there is, especially in what I was saying, there's a lot of kind of woolliness around this idea of authenticity, and I think, you know, for me, blurring that line between the sort of photorealistic, if you like, or the ones that use animation as substitution, and then the more evocative stuff like Sam's work, I think, no, if they're not, even though in this paper I've kind of conflated them to say they have the same tension going on, they may have the same tension, but it's different in each case. I think, you know, there's different work going on in each of the animated documentaries. So I think that this ongoing question of what is the referent, you know, what is, as Paul was saying, or Wells was saying earlier, you know, what is it that animated documentaries are indexing in the sense of pointing to? You know, are they pointing back, as you quoted what I said earlier, you know, back to the hand of the animator, you know, to the fingerprint on the puppet, or the, you know, the paintbrush, or, you know, are they pointing to some kind of imagined reality of dinosaurs that happened in the Cretaceous period that we think looks like this because that's what David Attenborough's documentaries look like? You know, I just think it's this very, this is what I love about animated documentaries, this very kind of, you know, we see the finger pointing, but we don't really know what it's pointing to, and that, to me, is where all that interesting space is.
Well, it's just one of the things when Bevan talks about low definition aesthetics, and I haven't written down Harryhausen, but there's that kind of thing that I'll watch some Ray Harryhausen, and I know it's not as realistic, or, you know, as kind of, you know, it's not perhaps capturing dinosaurs in quite as compelling a way. Well, in a certain way that Framestore and other people have done, but my God, I prefer it in a way, you know, because there's something even more authentic about it, and I think it's exactly that. It's not just trying to capture the dinosaurs. It's actually it's the kind of an amalgam of the dinosaurs as interpreted by Harryhausen. You know, you can physically sort of see him. Almost, you've got him there in your imagination, as it were, kind of bringing the thing to life, which is what animation is, after all.
Yeah. And I think that sort of that process of the activation of our imagination in animated documentary, which is why, for me, maybe I prefer the kind of Sam more, the sort of more evocative animation as a viewer, is because of this process of activating our imagination to imagine something that we then connect very deeply to the real world. And it's that kind of cognitive, you know, affective process for me that I find very enjoyable.
So another question about.
I'd just like to ask, maybe it's viewing outside more people's maybe comfort zones, the understanding of what documentary is, and this horrible word I heard before, which was edutainment and things like that. One of the areas that I quite like to ask is the element of digital media and its wonderful aspect of interactivity, and how documentary fits into that, because my understanding is that yes, we can incorporate a lot of the digital media within documentary, and it can be convincing in an aesthetically entertaining way, but when you venture into the world of digital media, you also venture into the world of interactivity, and I'm just wondering at what point does documentary then start to be challenged? You're all trying to say that.
Yeah, I don't think I have any way to answer that question particularly, apart from I know there's a lot of work. I mean, I don't think interactivity precludes documentary, as there's a sort of an area of scholarship on interactive documentaries, and there are interactive documentaries online. It's not an area I'm particularly familiar with, but I think that digital interactive documentary, but as demonstrated, I have a very broad church view of documentary, so.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I go there. I mean, the thing for me, the difficulty for me is the concept of documentary being you know, we talk about being a document, we think about it in terms of indexicality, or you know what you were saying, what your students don't compute when they get into this thing. But then, you know, you go back to an image like the Arnolfini wedding from the 16th century, and it was a painting that was used as a document. And it strikes me that we're at this moment. I mean, it's kind of what Lepanovich said, which is that the indexical image was a brief kind of 100-year anomaly in the history of visual culture going back 2,000 years, in which the kind of human hand, in a kind of Benjamin sense, was taken out of the process, and now it's gone back in. So, but I'm not sure that I was ever convinced that documentary, in that sense, was ever anything like as indexical. Or, you know, one of the things I was thinking earlier was the ways in which that documentaries used to have reconstruction in the top left or right hand corner. But of course, it's not like you have a whole of the Walking with Dinosaurs that says reconstruction. So for me, interactivity would just be one more level, I think, at which, if I'm being honest with myself, I would never think any documentary was an objective document. So if that makes sense, I'm not sure if that's kind of answering your question.
There are a couple of computer games.
Yeah.
So they would kind of fulfill your criteria. They're kind of gross, and really tasteless.
Yeah, the JFK, there's choosing one in, which is...
And then there's the whole other question about the games increasingly like Heavy Rain or LA Noire that are, you know, it seems that every single time there's a game that has slightly more levels, higher levels of aesthetic realism, for want of a better word. Everybody starts talking about how games are going to replace cinema, which is kind of interesting because I don't think, you know, it's kind of like saying that theatre is going to be replaced with film, but again, it comes back to that tension of is the aesthetics, is photorealistic aesthetics what we're approaching with interactive documentary, or yeah. I mean, it's not that they're trying to pretend they're documents, but at the same time there are aspects of these games, like driving around LA Noire. You drive around LA in the 1940s. There's a real weird sense that you're kind of half in Chinatown, the movie, and you're half, you know, in this, right down to them having Hollywood land on the hillside, you know, and having running around the D.W. Griffith's set of Intolerance at the beginning of LA Noire. But it's 20 years old, so it's degraded. But there's a certain level of that kind of interactive documentary in a way that it's in a game.
We're just about out of time, and I know Paul has a question. I'd like to get one in myself.
That's fine.
Not so much a question, but it is partly a question from both of you. I was really intrigued with Leon's term, a cinema of transactions. And I'm wondering if that in some ways it's a solution to one of your dilemmas, in the sense of what is it that these conflicts between realism and spectacle, for me, implies the idea that something is transacted, and it's pleasure, the forms of pleasure that transact. So I think it's really easy to get caught up in a kind of spectacle of realism conflict, whereas there's different gradations between the two that end up being what's transacted, or different levels of sensuous knowledge as opposed to cognitive. So I'm wondering if that makes sense.
Yeah, I suppose my problem, it's a pleasurable problem, as it were. I don't see it being a problematic. I mean,
Yes.
attention is a good thing for me. It's not something I'm seeking to resolve, but I like very much, I've written it down, cinemas of transactions, this idea of moving across different forms, which for me is now becoming increasingly the only way I can think about a documentary in general, is like how it is transacted, not just in the text itself, but in all the stuff that's surrounding it. And also, we were talking about earlier the kind of the way we're conditioned socially, culturally, you know, come through these, you know, media transactions, I think, particularly, you know, through advertising, etc. So it's a very powerful idea for me.
So just one coda for that, because I guess probably what prompted the question for me was the concern is, I fear that we tend to naturalize words like pleasure, or words like attraction. And these things are always historicized, I'm sure you know too. So I would think that it would be impossible for early cinema viewers to experience spectacle, for instance, because spectacle hadn't really occurred. So the kind of attraction that happened at that, in a way that happened after a mass media society. So how do we make these kinds of distinctions between different types of attraction, different types of spectacle, and hold on to those historical specificities? That's key. So this idea of transaction, I think, is exciting.
Yeah, because I think we can talk about historical transactions as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think also as this field develops, with all of us, I think this idea of historical specificity when we talk about animated documentary is going to become increasingly important because for a while it was just very nascent, but now it's all becoming historically relevant.
Well, we were out of time, so please let's thank our.
As David said, we have a full program, so I'll move directly to my presentation. What I'll be doing is I'll be looking at some of the central themes that recur in the discussion about animation as a language of documentation. I want to consider how new developments in contemporary culture in the world of animation demand a re-examination of past assumptions about animation's relation to fiction and documentation. For this reason, I'll be looking at how the field of online games sheds light on this topic. My focus is on the bi-directional influence of virtual realities on documentation, the documentation of virtual realities and vice versa, the virtualization of documentation, or specifically the documentation of the online games on one hand and games that are documentary on the other. In particular, I'll draw attention to the animated language of machinima and what can be called documentary games or participatory documentary platforms. So far, animation is commonly being regarded as an interpretive and or fictitious visual language because of its unrealistic form. Sorry, we cannot hear you very well. Can't hear well?
Can we use the mic?
Is that better? Yeah? So I'll be talking about the virtualization of games and gigs as documentary. Animation is commonly being regarded as an interpretive and or fictitious visual language because of its unrealistic form. For this reason, using animation in the practice of documentation introduces a supposed conflict. Whereas documentation connotes authenticity and authority to provide reliable evidence, animation does not disguise its own constructedness. I would suggest that the lack of direct photographic representation is one of the central elements that prevent animation from being accepted as a legitimate visual language of documentation. In the words of Joachim Weser, deviating from the simple rule of the documentary as embodying in its inscription a direct correlation to its physical referent shatters the vessel of both believability and trust, which is part of its public fait accompli. In other words, even though the concept of reality is not transparent and is being questioned widely in theoretical discourses, photography is still seen as more direct documentation because animation's varied stylizations generate a sense of uncertainty as it severs the representational link to the physical reference. As this is the case, and since animation has been contested as a legitimate form of documentary because it is not directly indexical, I'd like to stress that the relation to the physical is thus much stronger than we may like to admit as a criterion for truth value or the production of so-called facts. An examination of the use of animation in documentary context actually shows how it is still being used in relation to photography. Even though animation can be an immensely powerful tool, it is frequently used when photography of the physical is inaccessible. This explains the use of animation to engage with personal perceptions, such as memories, or uniquely individual points of view, when footage of the documented event is missing, or when information is censored and cannot otherwise be shown. Most of you will know the films that I'm referring to, and this is a film we'll be seeing tonight at the festival. So animation presents visually what cannot be shown photographically. But what if realities are not physical? This question question leads to an entirely different form of animated documentaries that demand a reconsideration of what is seen as real and consequently what is direct documentation. These new forms of animated documentaries engage with the essentially non-physical aspects of contemporary culture, such as online virtual worlds. Now, as we all know, the development of computers and network technologies has definitely led to the centrality of the virtual in contemporary culture, which has undeniably changed ways of thought and living. The online gaming culture is an indication of these tendencies and is worth exploring. Although statistics are constantly changing and growing, the gaming industry has grown from $10 to $50 billion in the past 2 decades, and in 2007 included over a quarter of the total worldwide internet population. Gaming has been described as larger than the film industry and is estimated to triple the value of the recorded music industry by 2014. These online virtual worlds in which games take place are currently being researched from a variety of fields, and it's thus understandable that they will be visually documented as well. It only makes sense, though, that developing forms of contemporary reality is demanding documentary modes. So how is this done? Virtual online worlds are, as we all know, animated, and they come to life through the visual technique of machinima. The term machinima is a contraction of machine and cinema, and is a convergence of filmmaking, animation production, and game development technology that can also be used to film interactive virtual spaces. In my opinion, the use of machinima expands the discourse of animation and documentation. It also contributes to an understanding of how documentaries of in-game events make possible a certain bridging between these online worlds and the binarily differentiated material world we all share. An interesting example of the evolution of documentaries is Douglas Gayton's 2007 documentary film, Ultra Alba, My Life in Second Life. The film relates the experiences of an avatar in the online game of Second Life. The film plot is about a character who disappeared from the physical first life to the virtual universe of Second Life. This may seem like a fictional plotline, but it can be understood as reflecting the increasing examples of people's preoccupation with virtual worlds and their preference to live their second lives rather than their first lives. Books titled An Exodus into the Virtual have already been written about this phenomenon. Extreme examples of this sort include the BBC coverage in March 2010 about a young child in Korea who died of malnutrition while her parents raised a virtual child in an online role-playing game. These may of course seem like extreme examples, but we all know that some parts of our lives do indeed now take place virtually on some level or another. What may at first be regarded as imaginary may be anything but fictional. The film Ultra Alba clearly blurs boundaries and definitions of fact and fiction, and in a documentary context between animation and live-action cinema. To try and begin to untangle the complexity involved, let me point out some of the obvious challenges with these binary definitions. So what is presented in this film is a documentary, in itself alluding to factual information, about an animated world associated with fantasy, where an avatar, a constructed non-physical character, assumable that this is fictional, although cyber theory expands on the theorization of avatars, represents the real or factual, albeit virtual, as is fact or fiction, experiences of a player who is a physical entity in an online role-playing game, which is still considered by some as an escapist form of fantasy and entertainment, but quickly appearing to be influential and central in contemporary culture. So at a glance, what we've got is this. What becomes obvious is that an attempt to categorize these new documentaries as either fictional or factual is doomed to fail. The realities involved demand that we reconsider our underlying assumptions. These changes expose a refiguration that ideas about reality are undergoing, in part due to the mediation of technology. Furthermore, the visual language used in the film Ultra Alba and the likes introduces the blurred boundaries between animation and live-action cinema. In fact, documentation through machinima refutes some of the central claims articulated in the past about animation as a documentary language. Let me explore some of these. Animation is a fictitious visual language. Disney's central role in the animation industry and the use of animation to represent subjective accounts of events contributed to the view that animation is a fictitious interpretive visual language that describes fantastical spaces. The term fiction suggests something that is imagined or invented and which is without basis in reality. However, animation documenting virtual worlds contradicts these claims because online role-playing games have become platforms for economic activity, marketing, socializing, politics, and much more. Since these worlds are inhabited by numerous players who respond to what exists in them visually as a basis for for activity and communication, viewing them as mere games and the visual language that brings them to life as fictitious can no longer be justified. Indexicality. The basic idea behind the index is that it affords a representation of a referent by some quality that they both share. However, indexicality is not a guarantee of visual likeness. Since every object relates to many others, there is this vast indexical potential beyond visual resemblance. As mentioned earlier, the difficulty in accepting animation as a documentary visual language stems mainly from its severed link to its material referent. Machinima demands rethinking of the concept of indexicality. Rosamund Proust described the index physical relation to its referent, whereas Martin Lefebvre distinguishes between direct and indirect indexical relations. In direct indexicality, the object acts as the efficient cause of a sign, such as fingerprints and photographs. Whereas in indirect indexical relations, the sign is only indirectly affected by the object, such as paintings or when fingers point to signifiers. Since these online game worlds are designed by the game's creators, the visual face of these games can be compared to paintings and thus to indirect indexical relations. Nonetheless, I'd like to present further ideas about machinima and direct indexicality. Some attempts to define cyberspace have described it as a new universe created and sustained by the world's computers and communication links, a common mental geography, a territory swarming with data. Shared mental geographies as a platform for non-physical encounters, experiences, and activities demonstrate that virtual realities shift the thinking of the real away from the material. Online worlds are brought to life visually through animation, which gives them a face that would otherwise remain textual, conceptual, or invisible. On one hand, since a direct indexical relation is based on the physical existence of the object referred to, no depiction of the virtual can be direct. On the other hand, though, machinima refers to real-time recordings of game actions within 3D environments. Although there are different ways of doing this, it's easiest to think of machinima like a moving image print screen function. As a recording of what takes place on screen in online environments, machinima is comparable to photography, only with non-physical elements. Since these images are not interpreted or created by the creator of the machinima documentary work, I'd like to propose that this is in fact a new form of direct indexical recordings. Machinima is a form of animated photography, in fact. The constructedness of animated representation in the creator's omnipotence. Animation's visual constructedness stresses the seemingly omnipotent power of the animator. Virtual worlds, however, are created by the game's algorithms and parameters or by designers and inhabitants of the virtual world, and not only by the creators of the documentary. As a continuation of the animated photography idea, since creators of machinima animated documentaries of the virtual do not necessarily construct what is viewed, and do not control the avatar characters depicted, but instead interact with them, the documentary creators are much like the documentary artist or filmmaker in the physical world. Finally, let me look at the idea of absence. Because of animation's lack of a direct correlation to its physical reference, animated depictions may be seen as representing protagonists through content or audio interviews, while simultaneously highlighting their absence. In machinima documentaries in virtual environments, the characters presented are usually avatars, who therefore signify the presence on set, if you may, of playing individuals rather than their absence. As a visual language then, machinima's documentation of the virtual refutes many of the reasons why animation is seen as indirect, constructed, and therefore less reliable or authentic medium of documentation. The documentation of a game world almost seems to factualize fiction, but what about the reverse? What happens when factual information representing actual physical events is relayed in an online world? In the past, machinima films concentrated on in-game events. However, a new direction is developing in which virtual realities and physical occurrences are increasingly intertwined. The digital artist and activist Peggy Weil and Nani de la Peña describe their innovative art installation in Second Life as exploring themes of immigration, nationalism, and civil liberties. Gone Gitmo is a virtual recreation of a Guantanamo Bay detention center operated by the US government to detain suspected terrorists. The installation combines avatar animations, voice acting, screen effects, real-life video, and a 3D build to immerse the person in the experience of being detained and deprived of your basic liberties. The idea of the work is to create an interactive platform where visitors may actually be able to get a feel of what a prisoner is like. My example embodies both topics of my presentation because I'll now show you a kind of journalistic footage made of this documentary virtual experience. what actually happens is that people go to Second Life, and this program kind of takes control of their avatar, and then your screen is blacked out, reenacting what it would feel like to have something cover your face, and then you find yourself in a cage, and obviously the first questions would be, could I call someone, can I have a lawyer? And of course all these options are not open to you. That's a shame. Many people who are unfamiliar with the subculture of gaming still disregard it as fictional or merely a game. Nevertheless, as growing numbers of people have more and more experiences that are virtual, it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss these experiences as fictional. Julian Dibble's famous work, A Rape in Cyberspace, explores the emotional, albeit not physical, trauma that virtual experiences can evoke. Dibble describes the power of online virtual experience as influential on the self by describing a virtual rape in cyberspace, the publicly sexual assault of a player's avatar, and the emotional, albeit not physical, violation that the victim nonetheless felt. Dibble proclaims that what happens in virtual worlds is neither exactly real nor exactly make-believe, but nonetheless profoundly, compellingly, and emotionally true. The idea of experiencing a sense of presence through a form of digital embodiment with which a player identifies can be seen in the ability of many games to provoke deep concentration and immersion through interaction and an attempt to achieve the game's goals. This leads to what Bosward and Interdisciplinary define as an illusion of presence caused by a sense of non-mediation in which a user no longer perceives the display medium as a separate entity. According to Slater, a high level of presence will help users remember a virtual environment as more a place visited than a place seen. The ability of first-hand virtual experiences to seem like places actually visited and as emotionally true explains why these games can be used as new platforms to create involvement and convey information in new ways. A powerful, although not the most recent, example of these so-called documentary games is the game Darfur is Dying, where the player is invited to choose an avatar and make their way through the everyday experiences of a Sudanese refugee. After choosing an avatar, the camp is shown, and below the levels of food, water, and health, as well as a threat meter. Different points in the virtual camp, symbolized here by question marks, lead to further information about the living conditions of the refugees. When the water levels in the camps are low, the player must leave the camp and, hiding from the Janjaweed militias, attempt to retrieve more water. If one is caught, information about what may really occur in these situations is provided, reminding the player that what may seem like a game over screen actually often results in kidnapping, rape, and murder. The concept of documentary or serious games may seem contradictory, because games are so widely associated with childhood and entertainment. However, as Johan Huizinga declares, play is at the heart of most serious pursuit of culture. According to Uli Rapp, games are a form of exploratory actions that help shape the human as a social being by exploring what is not immediately available and assuming different roles. So games help us learn and discover new situations, but can they have documentary value? According to Michael Renham in Theorizing Documentary, the documentary functions are to record, reveal, or preserve, to persuade or promote, to analyze or interrogate, to express. Similarly to other animated documentaries, although animated documentary games do not record the physical directly, they can reveal by depicting information otherwise difficult to visualize. By drawing interest and involvement, animated documentary games can preserve the information by raising awareness to the topic at hand. The game Darfur is Dying enables the player to assume the role of a refugee avatar. This game captures and portrays recurring events that, although not specific and therefore not recorded, reveal much about the political situation depicted. Animated documentary games can analyze by exposing angles of an event that would otherwise remain unexperienced by the player, and persuade by promoting specific perspectives on an event. By facilitating the first-hand experience of a simulation, they can also do this quite convincingly. By assuming the character of a modern-day refugee, the game developers seek to present refugees not as illegals or as threats, but as heroes who fled life-threatening situations in their home countries, and have now become victims of immigration systems, thus promoting a specific ideological stance. One of the main difficulties in regarding games as legitimate documentaries is around the narratology versus ludology, the study of games discourse. In other words, the question would be if an open-ended interactive event such as a game can be documentary because it leaves open certain options rather than depicting a narrative as it occurred. However, similarly to what Julian Dibble says, by being emotionally invested in an experience, the experience can become part of the self. For this reason, I find that the open-endedness of the game, the interactive approach to information, is what allows the experience depicted to be personalized. Furthermore, many documentary games are not commercially distributed. They're available online for free download and include forums, discussion areas, and external links regarding the topic at hand, usually promoting action. As such, these works surpass the role as games and are part of much larger platforms for learning, discourse, and action. As platforms of information become more and more interactive, this is a glimpse into the future of information-producing media. The extent of being invested in an experience or a game brings it to life in a whole new way, raising awareness but also creating a sense of personal, albeit not physical, involvement in the event at hand. By playing the game, players become what Tracy Fullerton describes as virtual veterans of an event. From personal experience, after playing Darfur is Dying, I can only say that any later mention of Darfur made me perceive it differently, bringing it closer to heart. In other words, what may initially seem fictional can actually end up seeming more real as one begins to feel personally involved. In conclusion, as part of the discussion of the shifting boundaries between fact and fiction, it's revealing to take into account the field of online games and virtual realities. This enables us to think differently about animated documentaries. By examining the documentation of an online virtual experiences, I looked at the visual side of the documentation of the virtual, showing how machinima refutes many of the more traditional ways of viewing animated documentation. Machinima shows that not only is animation not fictitious or necessarily interpretive, but is a new form of animated documentary that brings animation closer to live action footage than ever before. Content-wise, the combination of gaming characteristics that allow the player to become invested with a portrayal of actual world current events complicates the attempt to categorize virtual experiences as far from factual. In these cases, the participatory element of the game, alongside of animation's ability to present what was not photographed, allows the player to experience what would otherwise remain alien. By using animation, it's possible to transcend a photograph-specific event or a particular personal story and make it accessible to many people, so as to create a personalization of information, gaining a resensitizing effect in an image and information-saturated contemporary culture. This personalization of information and emotional investment is, as Dibble claims, what makes it compellingly and emotionally true, shifting the discussion to a new form of factual definitions rather than seeing in-game experiences as purely fantasy. If animated online worlds allow the creation of sets that facilitate new experiences that add information and contribute to an understanding of an issue about the physical world, who's to say that these works are fictional? And once again, the question is turned on its head, and realities are becoming ever more virtually oriented. For this reason, it's becoming increasingly apparent that in an era of virtual realities, our reliance on the physical in documentation severely limits ways of recording, engaging, and exploring the real. The process of virtualization requires redefinitions of the real as well as innovative forms of documentation to encompass these realities. I'm tempted to add that the centrality of cyberspace in contemporary culture has transformed material culture into one where notions of non-substance and invisibility have become defining characteristics of the era. As such, the ability to surpass the physical accentuates the relevance of the visual language of animation in contemporary documentary, making it no longer a fictional representation, but a highly informative one of emerging cultural tendencies. Documenting the virtual therefore demands reconsiderations of assumptions about fact and fiction, documentation, indexicality, and physicality. Regardless of whether it's clear how to place online realities and consequent animated documentaries categorically, they will be playing ever-growing roles in every aspect of contemporary life and probably future lives as well. What better conclusion to my argument than to suggest that it's time to seriously consider our assumptions of what is fact and what is fiction. Thank you very much.
If I do, I want to begin with showing you a very short scientific visualization called The Inner Life of a Cell, produced by Ex Vivo and animated by John Weebler in 2006. It's very short, if I can get online. So this will be the test. sound's playing, but the image is not moving. So. It is full screen. Okay, not full screen. Okay, I'll have to do it that way. It is fair to say that animation today saturates our visual environment and constitutes a visual vernacular coextensive with the production of most registers of cultural life. But it also has become a major tool for scientific visualization. It is used to see in order to know, that is, to model physical and organic mechanisms and processes that lie beyond the narrow spectra and scales of human perception. It is used today as much in the construction of scientific knowledge as it is in the construction of aesthetic fantasy. The same technical qualitative difference between these antinomic purposes can be very difficult to discern, producing yet another historical iteration of the scopic conflict between fact and fiction that first assumed its modern form with the invention of photography. In order to deflate the critical drive for the new, which is equivalent to the drive to dehistoricize, I will remind us that in 1840, not only did the painter Daguerre realize the dream of mechanical reproducible imagery, but had the astronomer Francois Arago present it for him as a scientific technology to a packed French Academy of Sciences with literally thousands of everyday French subjects filling the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of that proto-spectacle. And this revolutionary historical moment is an allegory of the problem that concerns me here. A scientist is required to speak for an artist in order to confer scientific legitimacy on an aesthetic technological invention. Animation presents a similar dilemma today. To digitally reconstitute the liminal zones between scientific and aesthetic knowledge, between fact and fiction, and to qualitatively rematerialize visuality and conceptions of realism in its own image, so to speak. The effects of cinema were the same, so it is incumbent upon us to ask, does animation's effect constitute any significant difference from its scopic ancestors? Or is it simply a form of the eternal return of the same species of epistemological questions that have occupied humans since we began to think? How to distinguish fact from fiction? Upon what documents do we justify fact, and which documentary forms are required to legitimize them? This question formulates, in my view, in precise epistemological terms, the problem of all animated documentary. One consequence of animation's invasion is that the real, understood as a state of pure, unmediated nature, has been augmented once again by an autonomous, fetishized zone of virtual simulation. In today's post-natural world, the natural objects and events that shape the majority of our experiences are digital simulacra, or deeply pre-programmed by them. I want to propose as an initial answer to the question of animation's epistemological uniqueness, Du Bois' concept of the integrated spectacle. The final sense of the integrated spectacle is this, says Du Bois, that it has integrated itself into reality to the same extent that it was describing it, and that it was reconstructing it as it was describing it. As a result, this reality no longer confronts the integrated spectacle as something alien. When the spectacle was concentrated, as in the USSR, the greater part of the surrounding society escaped it. When diffuse, as in a later phase in the USA, a small part. Today, no part. Du Bois raises here the problem of description and reconstruction, which in his view co-constitute each other as integration, in the phantasmagoric form of the spectacle. An example of this is scanner technology, which in order to reconstruct the object scanned, in effect, must first describe it. But no description is innocent and alters the object, its object in the process. No alienation between scanner and the scanned, computer program and its object events, between spectacle and reality can occur. In the collapse of alienation, judgments about the difference between fact, what we think we know but never really do, because it's always constructed, and fiction, what we think we can't know, because it's always constructed. And sorry, getting lost in my own mind here, let me try that again. In the collapse of alienation, judgment about the difference between fact, what we think we know but never really do, because it's always constructed, and fiction, what we think we can't know, because by definition it is untrue, but must also collapse. To break the hallucination of simulation today would be to reinterpret realism as the integrated effects of two congruent processes of description and reconstruction. In other words, if fiction is a hallucinated description of real life, and fact is a hallucinated reconstruction of the perceptual, then the only possibility of realism lies in an epistemological integration of these two polar forms of hallucination. Animation, then, is the epistemologically unique means of visual production of scanning, specifically. An animated documentary is the epistemological form of integrated fact and fiction that maintains the differences between them. These two premises, that animation is an epistemology of scanning, and that it is the form par excellence of integrated spectacle, assert that human history and cultural evolution have reached their anthropocentric enlightenment endgames. And it is in this sense that my title refers to fictional fact and factional fiction. Avatar is a tour de force for three reasons. Firstly, because in aesthetic terms, it is a radical animated spectacle committed to scientific realism, while at the same time an animated spectacle committed to radical political fantasy. Secondly, because in epistemological terms, it relies on scientific documents to legitimize this radical political aesthetic fantasy with such anthropological and materialist accuracy that it attains documentary status. And thirdly, because it constructs its viewers as both hypothesizers and experimenters with fact, which, while simultaneously constituting them as critics of fiction. In general terms, it is scientific legitimacy that determines the film's aesthetic imaginary. Lieber's scientific visualization makes the converse case with respect to the mechanisms of cellular biology. In the inner life of the cell, fact is rooted in aesthetic fantasy. It is aesthetic legitimacy that determines its scientific factuality. Scientific legitimacy rests on critical judgments of aesthetic imagination, just as aesthetic imagination rests on critical judgments of scientific legitimacy. Imagination today, as a form of integrated animation spectacle, is both aesthetic and scientific, suspended between fact and fiction, the two illusory endpoints of a spectrum of hybrid states of realism that lie between them. One implication of this claim is that all documents are fictional facts, just as all documentary is factual fiction. A second implication is that no analytical method can escape this dilemma. In other words, the limitation to those two objects of study requires that any film theory worthy of its salt must account for the legitimacy of what I will call the documentary effect. Only when we are both aesthetic and scientific judges can we be rigorous theorists of this documentary effect. We must recognize a hybrid imaginary determined by the hyphenated term, the scientific aesthetic. The planetary, I move on to a section now called materialist realism. The Planetary Society organization has stated that Avatar is the most science-grounded fantasy ever put on the big screen. To achieve this, Cameron worked with a linguist to construct the Navi language, with an anthropologist expert in Papua New Guinea shamanism on which Navi cultural life is modeled, while his composer worked with an ethnomusicologist to design Navi's sonic life. Cameron has gone so far to get things scientifically right that he has written a field guide that explains realistically the biology, astronomy, geophysics, and social history of Pandora. Even the Hallelujah Mountains and Unobtainium are theoretically realistic, based on the physics of superconductors that float in the presence of a magnetic field. In the case of the floating mountains, since they are made of superconducting unobtainium, their suspended state is perfectly possible because of Pandora's powerful planetary scale magnetic field. This scientific and technological realism is paradoxically the very ground on which the film's phantasmagoric form rests. Navi's size, strength, agility, resilience are believable because their bones are made of naturally occurring carbon fiber. A concept itself believable because all life we know of is constructed of carbon molecules. The Avatar driver's modules are convincing because their design intentionally mimics MRI scanners. In general, Avatar is believable, compelling, and evocative because much of its 17.28 gigabyte minutes exquisitely crafts a fascinating tension between fact and fiction. There are a few moments, if any, when fantasy is not firmly rooted in scientific realism. The documentary effect of Avatar is determined not by any factual ontology, but by an epistemology of fictional fact that determines the film's aesthetic production, that in turn legitimizes the film's aesthetic imaginary. The scientific aesthetic establishes a phantasmagoric form for relations between factual fictions that are identical to those of Lieber's The Inner Life of the Cell, and between a series of imaginary choices that the film constructs through analogies, thematic rhymes, allusions to historical documents and facts, in order to make judges of us. To repeat what I've claimed above, the judgment is double-edged. The scientific legitimacy sits in judgment of aesthetic imagination, as aesthetic imagination scientific legitimacy sits in judgment of aesthetic imagination, as aesthetic imagination gives phantasmagoric form to scientific legitimacy. Avatar constructs its viewers as scientific aesthetic problem solvers and judges of ethical dilemmas, social conflicts, and traumas produced by the two polar drives, Eros and Thanatos, as engines of civilization and its discontents. There's no question that today both life and death are the central themes of both Cameron and Wheatler's films, are brute commodities traded in our techno-scientific culture and made desirable or not by integrated animated spectacle realism, rapidly metamorphizing into hybrid science fictional form, too nascent and primitive to recognize, like those visualized at the microscopic biological level. So I now turn to anthropological realism. However, Avatar, however, does something else quite important. It pits documentary narrative against non-narrative documentary, forcing viewers to adapt to two opposing cinematic logics simultaneously. Judged by high art principles of narrative structure, Avatar is no doubt simplistic, populated as is by stereotypical characters. But the narrative is intentionally cliché, reductive, and must be interpreted as a skeletal structure of secondary importance, against which the primary content of the film may be heightened. The affective and emotional, the anti-rational world of pleasure, desire, fantasy possibilities of embodiment projected into an alien life form, and techno-natural social relations. The narratological principle of Avatar is that only one who has suffered trauma, as Jake has, can have empathy with the trauma of others. One can overcome trauma only through radical transformation of the cause of the trauma. Jake's transformation, however, is, if anything, retrogressive, a going backward in Enlightenment modernity's terms, to a spatio-temporal state perceived, though wrongly, as outside history, static, and without a future. In comparison, the inner life of the cell narrativizes the life and death struggles choreographed as a classical ballet to classical music of white blood cells sensing the benign and threatening stimuli of their environment. It shows them responding to both peaceful conditions and biological warfare. The contrast of these two animations reverses standard aesthetic interpretation. The scientific visualization in aesthetic terms is more similar to avant-garde structuralist materialist film than to the factual photoindexicality we customarily expect of the scientific. While Avatar's aesthetic appears, in comparison, far more realistic. In the context of such comparisons, it can no longer be claimed that, as is by Suzanne Bucket and others, that this power of animation resides uniquely in the fact that it can visualize events that are impossible in real worlds that must obey the laws of physics. The inner life of the cell depicts a world far more alien than that of Avatar, and deeply challenges the Enlightenment conceptions and models of empirical rationalist realism. Continuing with this critique of the anthropological, Avatar effectively substitutes indigenous local knowledges for Western universalist knowledges, inverting the entire epistemological structure of truth construction. As the shaman Moad says to Jake, "We will see if your insanity can be cured." In other words, Avatar subverts by inverting the Enlightenment's most cherished commodity fetishism, anthropocentrism. This is reinforced by Etude Khan's comment, quote, "This is the first warrior dreamwalker we have seen. We need to learn more about him." Making white man the subject of Nabi alienology. Cameron has reversed the politics of the Western scientific paradigm, requiring that viewers must instead assume the perspective of the indigenous epistemology that assesses the West from the subjective position of the factual fictionalized other. This is the very function of the Avatar vehicle. Jake doesn't save the Navi as a white man, but as a twice-born, authentic Navi, on their terms, in their body, through their culture and the local knowledge practices, and with their weapons. It is true that he is not only a Navi, that he brings with him some intellectual and biological knowledge of the white man's ways, but he adapts his Navi knowledges to be able to resist colonial capitalist military dominance. He effectively transforms Navi culture to a more modern form, extracting it from its pre-modern traditions so that they can adapt to the modern world and preserve those traditions in a new form. These reversals are meant to give an unequivocal response to the last question Colonel Quaritch asked Jake the Avatar before he tries to kill his human body. Hey Scully, how does it feel to betray your own race? Do you think you're one of them? Time to wake up. This subversion of the anthropocentric is a central aspect of Avatar, figured through the critique of the embedded anthropologist Grace Augustine and her science team, and through Jake's hybridized role as triple agent. He works simultaneously for the military-industrial science complex, for positive science, and for the Navi. This dialogue between Grace and Parker makes direct reference to the US military program called the Human Terrain System, or the HTS. My slides have been out of sequence this whole time. This is the dialogue I was talking about here. Parker says, look, you're supposed to be winning the hearts and minds of relatives. Isn't that the whole point of your little puppet show? You look like them and talk like them, and they'll start trusting us. We build them a school, da-da-da-da. So this was part of that whole sort of process. Forgive me, I guess my slides were out of sequence here. But, okay. Yeah, I've got just 5. Yeah, I'll be done in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a double.
Yeah. So the so the dialogue refers to the human terrain system, by which the military embeds anthropologists as part of military terms to gain information in Iraq and Afghanistan for purposes of their military operations. This is the point there. Okay, let me just go. So my point here is to sort of point out what the various documentary elements of Avatar are. I was just simply listing them to make the following conclusion. Avatar is then both an integrated animated spectacle constructed around a plethora of hybridized states of fictional facts and factional fictions, and an animated documentary about genocide, ecocide, and the ruthless hegemony of global finance capital. In addition to its direct allusions to the documents of the American Anthropological Society, to U.S. corporate militarism and its war against terror, and its use of embedded anthropologists, it has had profound impact on resistance movements among indigenous groups on a global level, who interpret the film not as another white messiah fantasy, but as a realistic representation of their place from their perspectives. Cameron even embedded a direct reference to the murder of Rachel Corrie, the young woman American activist working against the demolition of Palestinian homes in the West Bank. It has demonstrated that a blockbuster commercial film can have remarkable pro-social and effective political consequences. It has also proved that phantasmagoric form of animated documentary can be pushed to the extreme while remaining powerfully documentary. In conclusion, Avatar requires that we face the horribly discomforting fact that of our complicity in global genocide of indigenous life, and along with it, the values that are ecocentric, not the capitalist war-centric values of modernity, of which we are so ideologically dependent, and by which our identities have been so psychologically formed. Thank you.
Marc and Greg, do you want to use just again. Both emanating from the South Wales, they operate from 2 different organisations as well, one in the north and one in the Midlands. And since my family is Welsh and I was brought up in the Midlands, I feel some affinity. Thank you.
Okay, I think our paper is a little bit less than 20 minutes. Just get on with it. I'm a PhD student from the University of Salford, and I'm a practice-based documentary filmmaker. About a year ago, I was complaining to Marc that every time I went to make a documentary, I felt that I was pushed down certain routes. Marc suggested that maybe animation could offer me something different, so we started discussing. And essentially what we're presenting today is some of the groundwork that we've laid for what we hope will be quite a large practice-based project of animated documentary. And at the end, what's going to happen is I'm going to speak for a little bit, then Marc will speak for a little bit, and at the end we're going to show you just a little exercise that we've done, which hopefully sort of illustrates some of the points that we're going to make. So I'll just get on with it. Documentaries represent issues and aspects of the socio-historical world. They do so through a selection and combination of audio and visual components. Inevitably, this practice makes intrinsic claims about documentary's ability to represent the world both accurately and reliably. However, as the result of a mediated process, a documentary film is at best a crafted version of reality. The conventions of the filmmaker's craft are designed and developed to convince audiences of the authenticity of their particular representation of the world. In the vast majority of modern documentaries, the existence of absolute truth is presumed. The documentary filmmaker's role is simply to uncover it and to represent it to the viewer. The form has long been encumbered with journalistic and pseudoscientific expectations, the gathering of evidence, the balancing of material, and the objective presentation of accurate and informative data. Television broadcasters, still the main source of funding for documentaries, seek to retain audiences with proven and successful formulas. Since John Grierson first expostulated his theories on democratizing cinema, documentaries have been burdened with the reductive task of educating audiences. In conventional terms, the poetic component of Grierson's theories have been purged from the documentary mandate, while the tenets of journalism have been extolled. Overwhelmingly, documentary audiences are encouraged to trust in an objective reality, and by extension, to anticipate fidelity to it. Essentially, the aesthetics of documentary production combine to persuade the viewer that the voice of the documentary is truthful, honest, and reliable. And these are just some words that I think you'd probably find in any book about documentary. Of course, in documentary practice, the question of voice is neither exclusive nor literal. Documentary filmmakers articulate themselves through a selection and combination of images and sound, utilising all available means. This process requires an organising logic, as Bill Nichols calls it, or rationale. This includes decisions related to composition, sound, editing, narrative, material, and style. Each specific organising rationale means that individual documentaries retain a unique voice in spite of thematic similarities. In this sense, each film becomes one voice among the many voices in an arena of social debate and contestation. That's a quote, sorry, from Bill Nichols. Perhaps compelled by the notion of an organising logic, Nichols argues that the voice of documentary is the voice of oratory, that regardless of who is speaking and in what way, the voice of a documentary functions to convince the viewer of a particular perspective. Indeed, contemporary documentary production is dominated by this approach. The vast majority of documentaries, particularly those on television, are motivated by issues, whether social or political, which petition for the viewer's opinion. Obviously, they are generalising, I'm saying that's the vast majority of documentaries. Of course, there are people who don't work in that way. And this is just a couple of examples of people who do things a bit differently. Alexander Sokorov's documentaries are almost exclusively concerned with internal rather than external reality. Aesthetically, he concerns himself with themes and concepts which are difficult to document in any traditional sense. He questions conventional ideas of observation and understanding and deliberately impedes comprehension. He regularly uses non-diegetic narration, but his commentary is wholly subjective and lacking authority. The commentary does not explain the image, nor does the image illustrate the commentary. The whispering narration speculates and questions, generating a feeling of confusion and disorientation in the viewer. Alexander Kluge, consonant with surrealist philosophy, Kluge believed that traditional documentary production devalued the reality of subjective fantasy. For Kluge, dreams and imagination were as much part of everyday reality as the more conventional terrain of documentary practice. Kluge's narrators fabricate events and invent facts. He combines fictional sequences with documentary footage to create shifts in perspective. Of course, documentary production is a complex system of communication. Like any language, it has its morphological units and syntax. It has its regional variations, dialects and jargon. It has its semantics and its semiotics. Languages evolve, acquiring new vocabularies and grammar, while simultaneously shedding older, outmoded terms and expressions. Languages must adequately represent the changing needs of society. They survive through transmutation and adjustment, borrowing from one another, widening and branching in a process of constant change and renewal. With this in mind, the documentary filmmaker must similarly renegotiate the language of documentary through constant evolution of their own authorial voice. I'm just going to cut this little bit out here, just to go on. Roland Barthes frequently draws attention to the plural, right, some water, I think. I'm just getting really away with the sound of my own voice. Roland Barthes frequently draws attention to the plurality of meaning in any act of communication. I'm not going to read that. Just 10 seconds, just it's quite a famous quote, so maybe some of you already know it. Basically, interpreting text. Language is infinitely complex. It is full of hidden meanings and barriers, and the potential for misunderstanding and miscommunication is a constant danger. The semantics and semiotics of language dictate that there can never be a definitive meaning in any communication act. Barthes again elucidates on the effect of culture, nationality, and history on a multitude of potential narratives that shape the socio-historical world in one creative language or another. And again, I'm not going to read that. That's probably an even more famous quote, which I'm sure many of you know. Just give a second. Lots of narratives, as we've said. Lots of different ways of understanding the world. But it's dependent on culture, our background, our experience, and we bring all of this when we try to interpret the text. We can't forget about it. Contemporary approaches to understanding documentary's relationship with its own source material revolve around its representational capabilities. But given the fact that documentary production is a mediated pursuit which relies largely on mechanical processes, to what extent can documentary film accurately and faithfully represent the socio-historical world? Filmmaker and philosopher Guido Steyer draws on Walter Benjamin's 1916 text on language as such and on the language of men to argue that documentary production is a process of translating the language of things into the language of humans. She suggests that the discursive treatment of the real world in documentary is not so much about realism and representation, but about presencing and translation. The concept of translation in this sense is useful for reconsidering documentary's relationship with the real world. And I won't read that one either. By thinking of documentary production in these terms, the formal possibilities are dramatically widened. So out of this, basically, I came up with a few questions that I posed to my colleague Marc. What can animation do for me as a documentary filmmaker? Some of the questions: how can the language of documentary evolve by borrowing the tools and aesthetics from other art forms, in this case animation? What can animation offer the documentary filmmaker who seeks to expand their filmmaking vocabulary? And specifically, how can animation assist the documentary filmmaker who is looking to create more expressive, poetic documents of the socio-historical world? Can animation, for example, assist in rendering non-fiction explorations of internal, subjective and/or abstract realities? Well, yes, obviously. Further, how can animation extend the language of documentary without compromising its legitimacy as non-fiction? In fact, can animation reinforce the non-fiction basis of documentary? And thus, we're a handover.
Okay, this is a collage that I made a few years ago. It's the basis of the exercise I'm going to show you later on. At the time I made it, I didn't intend it to be animated, but when Greg suggested we use this image for the basis of the film, that's when it was animated. But in terms of what animation has to offer documentary, I'm going to talk specifically about collage and animated collage. A collage is a composite of disparate elements that creates a new whole. It is an assemblage and combination of various elements gathered from a variety of sources. Typically, it attempts to create a virtual space that has relatedness to the real and the actual through the appropriation of a variety of found ephemera that act as signifiers. The collage artist engages in the process of organising logic in the selection and manipulation of pictorial elements that are loaded with cultural and social resonance. In this respect, there is a relationship between the methods and motivations of the collage artist and the documentary filmmaker. So I think. Through the process of selection and manipulation, the artist appropriates signifiers and symbols. The composite image documents and records the phenomena that its components signify, whilst creating a crafted reality that questions, comments, or informs. Robert Rauschenberg described his use of collage as the intention to fill the gap between art and life. The animated documentary assumes its position in this gap, bridging artifice and actuality. A collage, emphasising concept and process over end product, is an inherently self-conscious artefact. Its language is that of association and synecdoche. Its interpretation dependent on assumed knowledge of the signifiers it contains. The viewer derives knowledge and meaning through interpreting the interrelationship of often incongruous and seemingly unrelated components. The juxtaposition of signifiers is a semiotic collision. I drank water to try and stop that from happening. It didn't happen. Sorry. The juxtaposition of signifiers is a semiotic collision, a subjective reality of authorial intention. I'm interested in the depiction of the real and unreal within a composite of photographic, found and drawn elements. This synthesis of the photographically real and the drawn or constructed unreal allows collage to join the actual and the truthful with the imagined and illusory. It represents the synthesis of reality and fantasy. Photographic and video elements in the context of the animated collage retain a fidelity to the material world, indicating the tangible and the factual. The drawn and constructed elements, through distortion, abstraction and exaggeration, have the potential to describe the internal, the subconscious and the unconscious. This tension and exchange holds considerable communicative power in addressing socio-historical issues by penetrating beneath the surface of the actual and the factual. The raw images, sounds and other found materials used in collage are often highly charged with personal, social, psychological, political, economic and philosophic implications. Paul Wells has commented on the power of this tension between realism and surrealism in relation to Jan Svankmayer's work in his article Animated Anxiety, Jan Svankmayer, Surrealism and Agiscape from 2002. Collage and animation. Arguably, the production of all animation, regardless of formal method, is based on the selection and manipulation of elements that refer and signify. All constituent parts of an animation, even the most abstract and non-figurative, will have their reference to an equivalent that provokes recognition and association. The word collage, derived from the French to glue, implies a relative permanence of the physical bond between material and surface. Through digital image editing, with its capacity for layering and compositing,
The collage is no longer fixed. The cut and paste is itinerant and dynamic, allowing for constant alteration and revision. The digital collage has mobility. This mobility has been extended and invigorated by the availability of motion graphics and compositing software designed to combine and animate all possible visual and auditory materials. The digital layer is free and unencumbered in the limitless three-dimensional space of the After Effects composition. As the collage of unlimited materials is animated in a boundless virtual space, its reality and meaning are invigorated, perhaps as Paul Wells would suggest in relation to his conception of virtual space. It engages, involves, envelops and persuades. In collage, the principal artistic mediation lies in the control of the context of the object and its relatedness to other elements within the composition. These juxtapositions, often based on relationships of scale and other compositional devices, can attempt to acknowledge, confirm, champion, contradict, mock or ridicule. The collage, like the documentary, in organising elements that embody actual socio-cultural phenomena, establishes a hierarchy of factual relatedness. How those facts are organised can prioritise some facts and negate others, creating a new version of reality consistent with the animator's authorial voice. This particular dynamic confluence of historical and cultural references affords a documentary filmmaker a powerful tool that has the potential to challenge opinion,